The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
What are my thoughts on Christians gambling? Well, it's very simple. Everything that a Christian has, we are stewards of. It's not mine. I'm a steward of it. That's it. And so everything that the Lord gives me, from my income to my time to my health, it is for His kingdom and His purposes. This is what the parable of the talents is about. This is what Jesus teaches us in the parable of the seed and the sower. The seed that fell on good soil produced a crop. And so as a Christian, if I take what God gives me and I gamble with it, I am not being a good steward of what the Lord gave me. So my thoughts on Christian gambling are my thoughts on Christians on how they should use everything that God gives them. Give it back to the Father so He can use it for His kingdom. Store up for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy. Guys, the love of money is the root of all evil. And if you're gambling, that's my thought.
All right, guys. Joshua, it's great to see you again, man. How you been?
I have been.
You've been?
I have been. It's been a crazy week in our neck of the woods.
Sometimes ministers just have to be, right?
That's right. Sometimes we just have the I am is existence, and sometimes
Absolutely.
to tap into that I am, you just have to be.
Sometimes. Well, man, I'm glad you're on. I'm glad that we get to bring you. This is episode 22 now, which reminds me that that means we're literally 2 months away from hitting our 2-year mark on this. And I don't know, Joshua, if either you or me ever thought that we would have done this for 2 years now. It doesn't feel like it's been 2 years.
It really does.
At least that's just me. But yeah, 2 years we've almost been doing this. And so we're excited to get going. We've got a whole nother topic wrapped up in what we're calling our contemporary concerns section of this particular podcast. This is your content warning, a Bible meets culture podcast where we break down modern theology versus biblical content. On with us today, I think for the first time ever, we have 2 guests in one room, which is pretty cool.
All right.
The closest we ever came was we had one guest in the same room as Joshua because his wife was on. When we talked about nurses and that sort of stuff. We have on with us Jeremy Weekly and Billy Bearden, ministers at the West End Church of Christ in the place of all things good and holy, Knoxville, Tennessee. Guys, welcome in.
That's right. Yeah,
thanks for having us, guys. Yeah.
So let me, if I remember correctly, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong. Jeremy, you're the pulpit minister, right?
That's me. Yep.
All right, and Billy, you're still the youth minister, right? Youth and family, youth.
I actually am the education and involvement minister now. We hired another youth minister.
Yeah, they shortened his title. It was he was the Yeti minister, youth education and involvement and teaching or whatever. Yeah. Right. They finally shortened it.
Yeah. Okay, I got you. Well, good.
So now I get my weekends back. Yeah.
There you go. Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for spending some of your time with us this morning. At least it's morning now while we're recording this. When you watch this here in a few days, it could be morning, night, who knows. But Joshua, I'm excited about this particular topic because it's another one that I think a lot of people have a lot of questions around. Maybe not all of them necessarily, answerable. In the sense of sometimes you just have to go, there's not always a black and white, I guess is what you say, right? Mm-hmm. I think we spend a lot of our time looking for black and white answers like, hey, draw me a physical line as to where I can and cannot cross. And sometimes it's just not there. And this one today is about gambling, stewardship, all those different ideas. You guys, if you're listening, you've either heard or you've watched the video that we just played for you guys, and it's just a woman giving her opinion. She, got asked a question. She's a Christian content creator on TikTok, and she got asked a question, hey, give me your thoughts on gambling, and she laid it all out there, right? Hey, you and I are stewards of everything that God gives us. We can nitpick some of these statements too and see what does and doesn't fit. She kind of ends it off by, look, the Bible says that the love of money is the root of all evil. And if you're gambling, then she kind of, I guess she kind of tongue in cheek there implies that if you're gambling, then clearly you have a love for money. But yeah, go ahead. Give me your initial thoughts, Joshua. What did you think of the video as a whole?
I thought as far as videos that we review on this podcast, that this one was probably one that I aligned with more than others. I thought she had some good things to say. I go back and forth as to my personal view as to gambling and the relationship between gambling and the Christian.
Right.
I watched some videos of other people talking about it in preparation for the podcast, and I think, kind of like you said, with the black and white line, I think that we try to draw lines in certain places that the Bible doesn't draw lines, and then we don't draw lines in places where the Bible clearly does draw lines.
Mm-hmm.
And it all, we talk about this on the podcast a lot. It all wraps up with definition. How do you define certain things, and what does that do as you try to kind of navigate through these issues? I do think that there are a lot of issues with gambling that are, and I'll just use the word, are sinful, and that motivate and prompt sin in our lives.
Yeah.
I do think that stewardship is something that all Christians need to think about more. As 21st century Americanized Christians, we are very comfortable with getting for ourselves rather than being generous. It's like, I'm not his biggest fan, of course, but Dave Ramsey has a really good statement. He says, you work and you get and you accumulate wealth so that you can give it away without harming yourself, without being in poverty. Yeah. And I think that's a really good way to look at our material blessings. When Kayla and I were looking to buy our first house, which is the house that we're still living in, so I guess our only house, we were, our prayer was, Lord, if it's your will for us to be in this place, which it was going to be very convenient. It was convenient to our workplace, convenient to my parents. It had a good little tract of land with it. We were like, if this is your will for us to be here, help us to know how to use it to help other people.
Yeah.
And it's been a great place to host devotionals and have people over for dinner, and we've done Bible studies there and all kinds of stuff. So being a steward of your stuff, though, I think is more than just writing checks to people or giving your money away. It's the allocation of your resources, and resources is more than money in a lot of senses too. So there's just some general thoughts. I'm curious to hear what these guys have to say, though.
Yeah, Jeremy, Billy, give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's one of those things. Sometimes I tell people it's not necessarily a right or wrong issue per se, as far as scripturally speaking. It's more so falls in the category of wise, unwise. Is it wise to spend a significant amount of your money trying to accumulate wealth that you haven't really done much for, right? And that there's all kinds of evidence. I was working in higher education when Tennessee looked at instituting the lottery, and that was a big discussion, right?
Yeah.
Because there was, will Christians benefit from this? And we'd have to say, I mean, I have a daughter that's at Freed-Hardeman right now, and we use the scholarship, the lottery scholarship. We've taken advantage of that. So some people would say I'm a hypocrite because I do that. So there's a lot of nuances to this, right? And I think more so it falls in the idea of wise, unwise, and then our influence as Christians. Who are we trying to influence? How are we trying to influence them? Do we hurt that influence by engaging in certain things? So in the state of Tennessee, if you win the lottery, it's required that your name is released. You can't hide. Yeah. So if you're gonna stand there and hold that big check, right? They take your picture and put your name in the paper, and everybody knows where you go to church. How's it going to impact your influence as a practical?
Yeah. I always wonder, for someone who won the lottery, would a church accept their donation, their contribution?
Probably not. Preacher out.
Yeah. But for me, a word both y'all said that I like to go back to is that word sin. I think sometimes as a culture, we stay away from that word too much. Excuse me. Identifying what sin is, and what exactly is a sin. Anything that goes against God's command, right? And so when looking at gambling, our use of money, I think a motivation goes a long way. I know a lot of churches, good churches, who have a men's ministry, and these guys, outside of an official like bulletin article or something, will have a fantasy football league, right? Yeah. And some of these guys, they'll just put in $10 into the pot just to kind of, and the winner at the end gets the money in the pot. And is that gambling? And the things like I think, like Josh said, I go back and forth with, there's different types of gambling, and I don't think, and like Nathan mentioned, I don't think there is a point blank black and white with some of this, but I think the conversation we're having right now is needed. Yeah. I think that's a good thing to do.
It's good.
Yeah, that's the whole point of. Yeah,
it's like Jeremy said. I'm sorry. I've always joked, like, if I won the lottery, the first thing I'd do, let's say I won $1 million. First thing I'd do is I'd pay off the church building that we built. I
There you
would
go.
pay off my home, pay off whatever my parents owed, and then I would resign from the church because they'd fire me if I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
You go start your own church. That's what you do, Josh.
Yeah,
Right? Go start your own
that
church.
kind of money.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh man, yeah, no, that's it was. We always joked about my grandmother because my brother is actually convinced my grandmother's won the lottery, but she won't tell anybody. Like she thinks that she's got all the money like hidden underneath her house. You'd never know it.
It's in the mattress. Yeah, it's in the mattress.
Something along those lines. But no, Billy, to your point, this is a conversation I think is needed, right? And it's one of those things I think we look at a lot of different things. You know, is there a difference between investing $5,000 in the stock market, versus spending $500 at a poker table versus going and playing golf with your buddies for a quarter a hole, right? Like all those things carry a certain amount of risk to them. Yet I would go as high as probably like 95% of Christians wouldn't bat an eye at the gambling quarters or even investing in the stock market. But all of a sudden, when you're in a different environment and you're playing, I guess, more carelessly, right? I mean, if you've seen my golf game, you could argue that betting on golf would be way more careless than, blackjack or poker. But there's a line there, right? And everybody wants to know, okay, hey, fill me in on this. And sometimes there's not let's go down the list and mark off every single situation you can think of. Sometimes you just got to talk about the principle behind everything. And so the principle behind everything in this particular video, because she says it a lot, is the principle of stewardship, right? Which is a really biblical principle. And so Joshua or Jeremy, whoever wants to, we made fun of each. I say we made fun of each other. I made fun of y'all before we came on. I'm the only one without all them extra letters at the end of my name. So one of y'all define stewardship for us.
And a hush all over the crowd.
Yeah, and I want to do that. And I want to touch on something you just said too.
Yeah.
I do think, not being nitpicky by any means, but I do think there's more layers, kind of like an onion aspect to this, where casinos.
Why are you bringing onions into this?
Yeah,
no, I'm kidding. There we go.
Casinos, for instance, like they are created for people to lose money. Like that's what their purpose is. Is that in order for them to win, a lot of people are losing. So I do think there's an element of the environment you're doing it, not to be nitpicky or say that what's the word? The loophole.
Yeah,
right. But I do think that plays into it. But stewardship basically is the intention behind your money, doing the best you can with what you have. Right. Yeah. That's not an academic example, but I think that's what it is.
Yeah, and I think you want to narrow it down to more like biblical stewardship. It's the idea of taking what resources God has given to you or blessed you with, whether that's your money, career, your talents, whatever it is, and managing those in a way that glorifies God, right? So biblical stewardship to me is more involved. Stewardship in general is just, in essence, the management of money or management of resources. So we talk about corporations being good stewards. So a corporation can be a good steward, but biblically, Christians, it's the idea of God has blessed us with more than just money. It's all relationships, whatever. How are we managing those things in a way that brings glory to God? How are we using them or investing in them? So that's kind of my definition, I guess.
Yeah, I like to think about Genesis 2 when God puts man in the garden. We have this kind of, no offense to VBS, but we have this VBS view of these Bible stories like, oh, well, Adam was in the garden and it was just tropical paradise and he was laying in a hammock on the beach doing absolutely nothing there with God. And Genesis 2 says that God made man to work in the garden. When he's expelled from the garden, he's going to have to work in thorns and thistles, but he still had to work in the garden.
That's right.
And so God put man in a place with a job and a purpose. And as long as man was fulfilling that job and purpose according to the standards that God had, everything was fine. And then the minute that stopped, things weren't fine. I think that's an interesting lens to look at stewardship with. Where has God put you? With what parameters has God put you in that situation? And how can you best use what you have in service to Him? And I do think that that's a point in the video that was really good. All that we have really is God's. And even if we live to be 100 years old, that's a small blip in the history of eternity. And so what we do in those 100 years with the gifts that God has given us, regardless of, and we talk about money, and money is important, but whether we're talking about money or our talents, like Jeremy said, whatever resources we have, doing all things to the glory of God really needs to be in the forefront of Christian thought. That Colossians 3:1 principle, doing
Yeah.
all things, serving Him for His glory. I think that's because I'm sorry to go off on a rant, but Colossians 2 talks about Christian freedom, but then Colossians 3:1 talks about doing all things, keeping your mind on things above.
Right.
Well, that really defines Christian freedom, I think. Um, can you? Should you? Well, that's an important question, and we need to talk about it. But while you're doing it, can you do it with your mind on things above? So
Yeah.
I do think that there is a difference, like Billy said. First of all, there's a difference between risk, like playing the stock market. I'm big in the livestock industry. If you go buy a cow one week and then sell your cow the next week, you are taking a risk that you will
Yep.
either make or lose money. And there's a huge difference between risk and gambling, in the sense of going to a place that is designed to take your money, and especially spending money that you don't have, or not continuing on. It can become a problem for a lot of people. It can become an addiction, and being very materialistic and greedy in your perspective. That I think that's an issue that each individual person has to deal with. And I don't know that it's a huge blanket that we can lay over everybody either.
Yeah. So a couple of things that you said, Joshua, because I just give you my thoughts too, because you guys kept talking about the things that we use to glorify God. Because there were a couple of things that went through my mind in the video. Is one, she mentioned the parable of the talents, right? She talked about how the parable of the talents is all about stewardship, and I think that that's absolutely right. I do. My thought process was, I wonder why she would go to the talents parable as a sense of gambling, right? And the reason I say that is because the lack of stewardship wasn't actually like irresponsibly getting rid of it. It was holding on to it too tight. I think there's a form of stewardship that we don't talk about enough either. Like, we want to harp on gambling a lot, but we don't talk about churches and not to, this is not throwing darts at any particular church, but churches that have, and I mean, there are some out there that have, millions of dollars in the bank for a rainy day fund, whatever that may look like. Is that necessarily being a good steward of money? And so you've got things like that. But the other one was, she kept talking about, and this is not an attack on the video. This is more or less, what would you say to somebody who, she kept talking about everything that you're blessed with, right? Your time, your money, your opportunities, your health. I'm like, okay, what do you tell the person that's in debt, dealing with cancer, how to be a good steward, right? And again, kind of like you were saying, Joshua, it's not always a blanket statement, right? But that was something that kept going through my mind, right? Because we don't ever talk about that. Like, how do I steward my disease in order to help others? It's something that I don't think we talk about enough either. We occasionally hear the story of like, oh man, how great of an example is that person who's going through all these turmoil, all these really terrible times, and you'd never know it, right? They're happy, they're going, they're worshiping, they're doing whatever it is they can. Again, I know we're kind of talking about the issue of gambling, but I don't think that we need to get super, super bogged down on stewardship is just checkbook, right?
Yeah. Well, Jeremy and Billy, I think y'all had an episode on Not Just Sundays, which, by the way, plug. If y'all want to go listen to Not Just Sundays, they haven't recorded in a little while, but there's a lot of good episodes out there. Y'all had one on like
reboot. You may reboot.
Y'all had one episode on like the person who can't get out of the house, who's trying to serve the Lord, and how can they? Why don't y'all talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and it's kind of the circumstances in which you find yourself, and Paul is master at through the Spirit revealing to us in Scripture that your circumstances don't have to always, your circumstances shouldn't dictate how you are going to serve the Lord within reason. So the idea is somebody who is sick with cancer, there's still ways that they can serve the Lord, but from the outside, we want to put, we kind of want to make a blanket statement over everybody that you have to do this, 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 and this, and you have to be here, every time the door is open. And for some people, that's not necessarily, it's just not feasible for them. So, Paul talking about wherever he is, kind of bloom where you're planted, kind of scenario. Because I know a lot of people with terrible diseases that have found ways to minister to other people because they can relate to them in ways that I can. They can pick up the phone and call somebody and say, I understand what you're going through, and really mean that. And so the mess that they're in can definitely actually become their ministry and reach out to way. So they actually can become in some ways stewards of the tragedy or the hard times that are going through. And the joy that they find in serving the Lord is being a minister or ministering to other people who are going through similar circumstances. And then just, we have to be real, sometimes in life, I like what you said, Nathan. It's how do you talk to the person that's, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt from medical expenses, and you want to beat them over the head about being a steward? So those are challenges,
I think motivation and intention go a long way. When you brought up the investing idea, I think sometimes we paint this, broad statement of gambling's bad, investing's okay. And there can be plenty of opportunity where investing is not being good stewards of our money. I know people who put copious amounts of money in investing, and they'll go make statements like, oh, we don't have money for that, or, oh, we can't afford that, or because they're being so hyper vigilant about future and about investing for their family, which those can be good discipline, the good principles.
Yeah. That's kind of like the parable of the rich fool.
Right.
Tear down my barn and build up.
Exactly. If you're giving too much, I think that's not being a good steward. And that too, similar to gambling, it's bad. But in this video, at the 56-second mark, which is right there at the end, and Joshua's the big text guy, so Joshua can talk about this more, but she's obviously using the King James Version, which is already a problem, or she's just misquoting scripture. But she says there that money is the root of all evil. And I know this is nitpicky, but the King James does say that. The rest of the translations of scripture say what? The root of all kinds of evil. And I think that's a big difference here. Money is a great thing. The church, the Bible talks about money. Paul talked about money, about how, we're worthy of our wages, and talks about the idea of giving, like you're supposed to do that. Now, I know some churches have taken to the extreme and have made people give and put certain amounts on that, and that whole idea of tithing. But I think money is not a root of all evil. I think money is a blessing for a lot of people. It can be the root of all kinds of evil, though. And so I do like her whole point, though, there. I just think that either she's reading from the King James or might have just misspoken.
Her own translation. I tell people all the time, I quote from the Nathan Foster translation. It's just a bunch of different translations of things that have all combined in my head. So
yeah, a little bit of everything. Yeah, and I think Josh mentioned this early on, that things like gambling, if we're going to come back and talk about gambling specifically, you can open yourself up. The idea of covetousness. Jesus talks about in Luke 12:15, take care, be on your guard against all covetousness. Well, that doesn't mean just you're coveting one thing from your neighbor or something. It's the idea that it opens up this world, and it really does. There's a lot of things that we can fall into the traps. And that's, 1 Timothy 6, 9 and 10, he talks about the snare, the snare of riches. And I think that's part of the enticement of gambling is I'm going to get rich.
Yeah, and get rich quick. That's a big difference, because investing, saying that investing is okay, it's not a get rich quick kind of thing. Gambling is meant for that. And the Bible specifically talks about the idea of trying to stay away from those get rich quick kind of schemes.
Yeah, it's definitely a different feel. And I think, Jeremy, you hit a big word. I think greed is I think that's, I'm not going to say one of the issues with gambling, but I think we ultimately perceive all forms of gambling, like regardless of what it is, right? How many have ever bought, because I think you can't necessarily just throw a blanket over all what we call types of gambling. But I use the investment thing, Billy, because I remember it was my senior year economics class in high school. My economics teacher stood up. She started the same class every single year the same way. She said, I want everybody to realize right now the stock market is just legalized gambling. Is all it is. And again, you grow up and you learn that's kind of overly simplified to some extent, because there's a lot of, but again, those people that are professional gamblers would tell you the same thing. There's a lot of work and effort and strategy and things that go into this, but we look at things like, your greed, your motivation. We look at things different from casino to investing to golf course to buying a raffle ticket at your kid's school, right, for a door prize. Like all of those are forms. And so I think greed is a big thing, right? And I think we want to throw the blanket statement of greed over all forms of gambling. But there are two R words that we've said a couple of times throughout this that I want us to kind of to touch on, because I think when it comes to gambling, when you're trying to separate the two and you talk about things that might venture into a dangerous behavior versus things I think we would consider acceptable, are risk and responsibility. What's the actual risk factor of what I'm wagering? And am I doing so in I want to say completely responsible, but again, those are broad term definitions, right? But in what I would say the common sense person would consider responsible, right? Nobody, I say nobody, okay? Very few in the minority would say that, hey, if you were together with your dad, your brother, and your uncle, and you go, hey, let's play, you two versus us two for 50 cents on this next golf hole. I don't think anybody would call that irresponsible in the sense of gambling. However, hey, I just got a $7,500 bonus from work and I'm going to throw it all in this startup business. Okay, there's a lot more risk, especially if there are bills at home that you need to pay, if there are car payments that need to be made that you're struggling with. There's a lot more risk and there's a different level of responsibility that you have, not just to yourself and not just to your family, but to God as well when it comes to who you're taking care of and what you're supposed to be doing. And so, talk about that for a second, Joshua, if you want, or Billy or Jeremy, or whoever. Where does risk and responsibility play a factor in gambling as well as our stewardship as Christians?
Well, I think you can bring those two together with one word, and that's wisdom. We have to be wise in how we operate in life. The book of Proverbs is a great book just for daily living, and Proverbs has more to say about money than I think any other book in the Bible has a lot to say about money. Anytime in the Bible as a whole, but especially in Proverbs, that debt comes up, it is always in the negative, always, every single time. So debt is not a good thing. Debt might be a necessary thing for some people. If you have to take out a loan, like I was telling you, I had to take out a loan to get some home repairs done just this past week, and we had our repairs done this week, actually. We needed to do that, but we did not take out more than what we knew we could pay back. Even if both of us lost our jobs, we could still pay back the loan. Yeah. We were, I'm not trying to give too much information about our private financial life, but wisdom is what dictates how we spend our money. Yeah. There have been times in my life where I have made very unwise purchases. And there have been times in my life where I've made very good purchases. That one thing that I do, talking about risk and buy, sell, and whatever. I work as an auctioneer. Most everybody knows that. I go to these sales and I buy the cheap stuff, and then I take it home and put it on Facebook and triple my money. That's just economics. Buy cheap, sell high, supply and demand. That's all it is. To me, that is very different than gambling in the sense that most Christians think about it in the negative. So for me, it's you brought up two words, risk and responsibility. For me, it's two different words. Is it an issue of contentment? In other words, do you feel like you have to get more than what God has blessed you with in a way that you have to it's not just getting more in the sense of earning money. It's getting more to the nth degree, the millions of dollars or the thousands of dollars off of one hand of cards or a ticket you get at the gas station. And do you have a problem with working for what you get? Mm-hmm. Because gambling requires no working. It's all chance. It's all luck. But I think a good passage for our listeners to keep in mind is Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. Paul says, the one who steals must steal no longer. Instead, he must labor, doing good with his own hands. And here's the stewardship part, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. Yeah. Work with your own hands. Quit taking from other people. Work with your own hands and then get so you can give. I think that's a really good principle financially for people to follow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, Oh, I'm sorry.
Go for it. Go for it.
I think that comes back to the idea of what's my purpose in engaging in this activity. Like you talked about on the golf course, me and my dad, if we're playing golf and we just want to have a little fun and razz each other a little bit, it might be, we're going to put a quarter up, see who has the longest drive or something like that. It changes a little bit for me, as, the responsibility I have with with my influence. Mm-hmm. Again, I go back to that. So if there's a person, perhaps I've been trying to influence, to come to Christ and they're with us, I'm definitely not going to be doing that, right, on the golf course, simply because that gives people that open, door opportunity to say, hypocrisy, you preach one thing and do another. And so it's just that idea too. And then, with what's the difference in, you're helping your kid raise money for, their softball team, or, a program at school, they're trying to start doing something good. And I'm just trying to get as much money as I can as quickly as I can. And, right, Josh is right. Proverbs, man, they just all over the place in Proverbs. It's the idea of 15:27, whoever is greedy for unjust gain troubles his own household, right? And then 28:22, a stingy man hastens after wealth. And it's this idea, it's about me. But that can also happen with investments, 401ks, IRAs, 403bs. All those things can become a snare for us, mm-hmm, because we're only trying to accumulate wealth for ourselves. Right.
And here's I guess a cop out too. One thing Scripture says is that addiction is a sin. And so this can easily lead toward addiction. Mm. And Gamblers Anonymous, on their website, I kind of looked it up today and just looked at what their website has to say about it. Yeah. They asked some questions that kind of lead toward, like, you can tell this is a problem or not based on your answers. Some of those questions, did you ever borrow to finance your gambling? Have you ever committed or considered committing an illegal act to finance gambling? Have you ever gambled to escape worry or trouble or boredom? Also, did you gamble to did gambling make you careless toward the welfare of your family or yourself? Things like that. Have you ever gambled longer than you planned to? So I think those are kind of some times where those are some marks where it's like, yeah, this is now getting in the way of what I'm supposed to do as a good steward, as a father, as a husband, mm-hmm, as a Christian. Yeah. As an employee, all these, I think these are some clear answers where we can say black and white. We like black and white. Yeah. Some of that. So I think we can kind of narrow it down a little bit.
Yeah. John MacArthur had a great video on 10 underlying, and he called them sins, and they really are, that underlie gambling. And I think, mm-hmm, it's kind of the same principle, Billy, that you brought up with Gamblers Anonymous. If you're struggling to figure out is what I'm doing, if I'm gambling or whatever, let's just say, in a broad sense, even if it is a quarter on a golf course, right? Do these underlie the action? And here they are: materialism, greed, discontent, exploitation, lust for entertainment, distrust of God, disdain for work, irresponsible stewardship, which is what we've been talking about majority of the podcast, failure to provide for your family, and not loving your neighbor. That's a pretty good checklist to figure out if what I'm doing with the quarter on the golf course or with the thousands in Vegas, right, is or isn't causing a gap between me and God.
Right.
Yeah.
I like that. And I think a lot of that falls under just my opinion, and y'all can disagree. I tell people all the time, you're more than welcome to disagree on this podcast. Joshua gets uncomfortable, but I think it makes for better conversation. But I think a lot of that falls under that idea of responsibility, right? Like Billy, you were talking about you're reading all the things about the Gamblers Anonymous. All of those questions kind of hinted at, hey, are you putting gambling above the responsibilities that you have to other people? And so when you talk about stewardship, and I think I kind of mentioned this beforehand, we're going to kind of circle back to this. When you talk about stewardship going hand in hand with responsibility, I think what a lot of people immediately want to go to is, especially church people, right? Church people, I use that term, however you want to define it. We immediately want to go to contribution, right? Our giving to the Lord. And you probably, look, Joshua likes to say, I've recently stolen this from him. Joshua likes to say that I've been in church a long time. Like, I grew up in church. I was born, and a few weeks later I was in church, right? So I've been in church a long time. So I've heard a lot of grown men talk about, right before contribution, Lord, help us to be good stewards of everything that you've given us, and let us give back according to, what we have available. And so I mentioned this to you guys before too, because this has become a really popular subject. And again, it kind of goes along the lines of, hey, draw a line for me, right? What exactly do I have to give? Which I don't think is the right question, but it's a question that generally comes up. What exactly do I have to give in order to be considered a good steward, right? And so I told you this. It hit the news earlier this week. Judah Smith, who's a mega church preacher out in Seattle, is recently been filed in a class action lawsuit for him and home church where he preaches, for requiring their employees to tithe or give contribution of 10% of their gross income, which supposedly violates Washington state law. And so he's really, he's actually, I was reading through a bunch of these articles. He actually made the comment that tithing was more important than any other aspect of worship that you can come and be a part of. That's a whole nother podcast in and of itself.
Hey, that's because he buys like $5,000 tennis shoes. That's why.
Like I'm not. Yeah, like there's a whole nother podcast there. One of these days, Joshua and I are going to do a podcast on mega church.
Moving
culture.
on. Moving on. Yeah. Look at my jacket.
But yeah, anybody that works for home church is required to give 10% of their gross income, and then after that they take taxes out and so on and so forth. And so this all came about because one of the employees totaled a vehicle and got really behind with car payment and medical expenses, and she cut out her tithing for a while. And so the church reached out and said, hey, if you don't start tithing again, you're opening yourself up to termination. And she said, look, I can start tithing again, but it's probably not going to be the 10% until I get my finances more in order. And they let her go. And so that's being debated in a court of law right now. And so there's a responsibility that Christians have, but I think that's a great example of trying to bind where we shouldn't, if I can use that term correctly. But yeah, I think it all kind of falls under the responsibility aspect. And so if you guys want, try to, or don't try to, talk about whatever you want. I don't care. When it comes to being a good steward, what are the responsibilities, I guess, if we can use that word? What are the responsibilities of a Christian when it comes to being a good steward? Because we've talked about this. We talk about it in the form of gambling, but we also like to think, we've got this misconception that saving a lot means that we're being a good steward, and that's not necessarily the case either. Jeremy, you mentioned the barn owner. So when it comes to being a good steward, what exactly is a Christian's responsibility? Talk about that for a second.
I do find it interesting because, there are some people who, big name, like Charles Barkley, $5,000 on a hole of golf is like a quarter to him. And so the question does come up, and I think it's a good conversation of, do certain people have a higher level of responsibility in their stewardship than others, or is it equal across the board?
No.
I'm a big believer in a weekly contribution and giving back weekly. I think we see a New Testament mandate for that. I'm not a believer, and it has to be the same every week. I don't think we see that where, okay, we've said $200 a week, so it has to be $200 a week, or else we just don't give. I don't see that anywhere. I do believe you are supposed to purpose that in your mind. I do think it's a good practice if you do a budget each month or whenever you do that, to say, here's what we're aiming for, and we're going to try up front. But obviously, the battery in the car dies. That's $200. So maybe this week, $200 isn't going to hit it. But what could we do? And I think there is a good conversation to have there about levels of responsibility and stewardship. One thing I think is comical, like you mentioned just a second ago, there is no New Testament, at least in the translation I read, the couple I read from regularly, there's no New Testament mandate to tithe 10%. Right. That was a common, I think, example and practice given at the time to give people an idea. And I think it is an appropriate idea. But my point here is, I do think it's comical. Every church in America, from what I know of for churches, they might not practice the Lord's Supper every week. It might be a monthly or quarterly thing, but they will practice contribution.
They'll
every
always
single
take
week.
their money.
They will always, every week, pass a basket or have a QR code. And
Make sure you know where that kiosk is.
Yeah, and I find that to be interesting to your point you made about how this person claims that that's the most important part of the church, and because for him it is.
Yeah.
It is the most important part of the church for him. So that's no surprise to me when you said that. I have no idea who he is or his life, but it's obvious from that practice that is most important there. And that doesn't make it okay.
And I think when it goes back to, how do we become good stewards? What is that definition of that? Or, in our giving, I think it has to start with the right motivation. Mm-hmm. I think, if we're not giving with a cheerful heart, and we can debate what that means all day long, some of you more Greek scholars here, but the concept there is I'm not supposed to under compulsion, like say, I'm writing this check and I really hate doing this. Yeah. It is the idea of I'm seeing this as a gift. I'm making an investment, so to speak, in the work of the Lord, whatever that looks like. It may be used to fund, missionaries who have decided to leave their home and go and preach the gospel. But it also might be used to pay for, the trash pickup every week, where the truck comes and picks up the dumpster. And I mean, these are all things that it's hard to define that. And working in the college setting and fundraising for a little while, that's one of the hardest things to raise money for is the general fund, which is what operates the school. Everybody wants to build a building or they want to start a scholarship, but the trash has to be taken out every week, right? You got to do something with the trash. And so it's this concept of our motivation, our understanding of why we're giving. And that's really become important. Barna has some research on this. The younger generations are starting to speak out, especially in churches, and they want to know where the money goes. They're willing to accept that you got to take the trash out. They just want you to tell them that that's what happens with it. Right. They want accountability on that. So on our standpoint, perhaps we as the church have not done the best job of communicating where the funds go, what they're doing, to encourage our people to help shape their hearts to know that the motivation of the leadership is we want to really do the work of the Lord. I preached on this a few weeks ago, and I was talking about, what return on your investment do you expect when you give money to the church? Do you expect better sermons? And everybody laughed, and I was like, well, they probably do in some degree. Why am I giving this money? We need to be asking that question of ourselves. And if we're doing it with the right motive, a good heart, then I think that's really going to solve a lot of these issues with, am I giving under compulsion, or do I feel like I have to, I want to, I desire to do that? Yeah. And a point that's well off topic, but I have to mention it because the passion of mine is, is local church membership. I truly think as a Christian, are you doing a dissertation on that or something?
That's my recent passion. Yeah. As a member at a local church, you shouldn't be surprised that you're to give, because I think that is something we see in Scripture, that you are to give to your local congregation. And so I know some people who will say, well, I give, to charities, and I give to, as a member of a local church, that's why the younger generation is questioning this, because we're seeing less of them place membership at local churches. But I do think it's about intention behind your giving.
And we're seeing these people like, these guys that are, they're wearing $5,000 sneakers and prosperity gospel stuff, right? That all falls into it. And so it comes back, you talked about, Nathan, risk and responsibility. Some of them actually view giving as a risk to the church. And it's like, well, what are they going to do with that? And I've had people say that to me. What are they doing with this? And I'm like,
to your point, it's one of those things too, where, we talked about how more and more people want to know where it goes. I've met members who, in the memo line of their check, they give specifically to support, and I don't mean this in a mean way, but it's never. I've seen it on 3 separate occasions. It's never out of a sense of this is what I want to support. It's I want to make sure that my money isn't going toward X or Y or Z. And that. Again, I think you're kind of missing the point of everything. Like, I understand that you don't always agree with everything that the elders decide to send money to and pay for, or whatever, et cetera. But there's a lot of that stuff. And I think, Jeremy, to your point, I think that a lot of churches, they want to be and again, maybe this is just the cynic in me. Okay, I don't mean to paint the church in a negative light by any means. Maybe this is just the cynic in me, but I think a lot of churches don't necessarily like a lot of people knowing what they spend money on because they're afraid people might get upset about how much they spend in certain areas, and therefore they're going to start losing money, quote unquote. People don't, I've known of elderships who didn't necessarily want the church to know how much money there was in savings, but at the same time, they wanted money in savings because they had a very adamant belief that if contribution went to zero, the church needed to sustain itself for the next 2 years. And so that's how much they needed to have saved up. And so I'm telling you, you see some crazy stuff when you start getting into the world of money. And that's why stewardship is such a big deal. Whether you're talking about giving it away or gambling it or saving up too much, that's why it's a really, really big thing.
Nathan,
so
let me speak to tithing just real quick, because Billy is absolutely right. There's nowhere in the New Testament that mandates that you give a certain percentage. It's give as you've been prospered, give with a cheerful heart. That in the Old Testament, though, there's nowhere that mandates only 10%. And I use the caveat of only, because there are 3 tithes in the Old Testament. And if you add up the percentages, it's around between 20 to 30% of your annual income. Well, if I was to give 30% of my annual income, hey, we're in a recession. We're in inflation. I don't know that I have 30% of my income to give.
Right.
For us to continue to
make 3% of my
No, preachers, the government gets that off the top.
I don't even get 30%.
That's right. So
Billy's making that big money.
Yeah, man.
Well, we
I'm in
always
that other category up there. I'm in the category of blessed heart.
But we always want to point to the 10%.
Yeah.
Well, if you actually go back and look at the Old Testament, you've got 3 tithes in different contexts that are way more than 10%. And there are people in congregations, you guys have them, we have them here, who give a lot more than 10%.
100%.
And then you have some people, like Billy said, who it's all they can do to write the check or put, a 20 in the basket or whatever. It's so in the video, she talks about the parable of the sower. Of all the passages she used, that's the one that's taken out of context. But in the end, you want to know what a parable is about? I believe we need to be teaching the seed and the soil. Fine. But at the end, some of that seed that came up, some produced 30, some produced 60, some produced 100. The issue is not how much you're producing. Yeah. That's never the issue. The issue is, are you producing at all? And, Christians need to know that. Because we're all
that's a whole other podcast too, right?
Yeah, sure. But we're all
so that's like,
you're welcome for all the content.
No, man, that's that's a whole other podcast, right? So right. That's a whole other podcast.
And
how often do we
give it back to the church?
Right? Yeah.
Sorry, Nathan. Go ahead.
Well, no. It's just how much do we as Christians want to compare ourselves and think of ourselves as better or worse to others because we're producing more, we're producing less. There's a whole other thing there. I actually preached on something similar to this not that long ago, and Joshua's right. When you go through Scripture, the commonality was anywhere from 20 to 30%. Research will tell you that the average church-going American, on average, contributes 2%. And I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with 2%, but I do think when you go through that and you go, hey, what is the percentage? I stole this from Jerry Barber years ago, but Jerry Barber did a really phenomenal sermon. He's like, that's not the question you should be asking. He's like, I can answer that question for you. He said, the smallest amount in Scripture that I can find is 10%. He said, the largest amount of the percentage I can find is 100%. He's like, those are the 2 percentages that you can kind of find in Scripture. He said, so I think anywhere in between that, you're probably pretty safe, but that's not the question you should be answering when it comes to stewardship. So, but guys, as we're kind of wrapping up here and getting low on time, I want to do something real quick. I want you to go and try to answer this question. I'll go first, just because 1, I want to take away the easy option, and 2, I'll give you guys some chances to think about this. I'm telling you, man. So I told you I don't have letters after my name like you guys, so I got to take the easy ones off the top. But so if somebody's looking at this line and they're asking the question of, because again, we understand we can't necessarily do this, right? There's not a black and white line in the sand for every single scenario that you can kind of come up with. So for people that are maybe struggling with this, or people that are going back and forth on how they believe, I think Jeremy, if I'm miscrediting somebody, I think it was Jeremy, said at the beginning, you're teetering more of the, is it wise or is it unwise? And so for people that are kind of in this middle zone, I want everybody give me one concept or ideal that a Christian can look to and help them make the decision when it comes to stewardship, when it comes to gambling, regardless of the scenario. How can I decide if this is wise or unwise? And I won't even take the easiest one. I'm going to go first. I'm going to say I think looking at the idea of self-control is one of the utmost important things. I know you guys thought I was going to say motivation, but I'm going to use self-control, right? So that one's still out there for you if you want to take that one. But self-control, right? Am I doing this? And this is kind of one of the things that I've always seen when it comes to giving, gambling, whatever the case may be. Am I controlled enough that I've got a limit on myself? And do I care that I know I'm going to lose X amount of money, right? Right? Like, does it hurt me if I'm losing? Because again, does it hurt anybody to lose 50 cents on a golf course? Generally, no, it doesn't. Does it hurt somebody if somebody goes, hey, I want to invest, 10 grand of your savings account? Like, okay, self-control is a big deal. Am I going to get out of control? Are there things that I need to do more so than what it is I'm doing right now with the money that I'm using? And so monitoring your self-control, I think, has got to be one of the most important keys to this whole conversation. Am I able to set boundaries for myself and stay within those boundaries while I'm living and stewarding the things that God's blessed me with?
That's good. Good thought.
So for me, this is an answer that requires no letters behind your name. I'm going to say, and not in a negative sense, I'm just going to say common sense as a Christian. Yeah. My parents would always ask me when I was younger, if you're having to ask if it's okay, it's probably not. And so I've kind of tried to live by that some. And so if you're even having to ask, it's good to ask questions. We should ask questions. So I'm not saying that that's always the answer. But if you're having to decide common sense, is this okay or not? Well, I mean, like you just said, if I'm in a fantasy football pool and which I mean, I don't do this because I'm not good at that kind of stuff.
It sounds like you know an awful lot about it.
But this is the example I keep finding out there is that guys.
I must not be in the same March Madness bracket thing you got.
Well, that's a good one too. March Madness, If we're putting $10 on it, common sense, is that okay? Well, okay, I think that's fine. But like you've given examples, there's more dramatic ones. And there's equivalents for different people. But I think common sense as a Christian goes a long way. We've been given the Spirit, our conscience, for a reason. Now, our conscience could be corrupt, depending on what we do with it. But we've been given that for a reason. And I think that really could guide us a lot. Instead of trying to judge everything, we just take a step back and say, what makes sense here? I think that can go a long way.
Yeah. I think mine is probably, I've said it more than once on the podcast today, is influence. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 6 and in that discussion in chapters 8 through 10, it's like the idea of, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are profitable. Right. And that's in terms of, if I'm engaging this, am I becoming a stumbling block for somebody else? I think I preached on this years ago, the issue of gambling, and kind of how I finished is I said, well, what if I told you that before I started work here at West End that I had played the lottery and won, $1 million? Would that change how you look at me as your preacher?
Yes.
And be like, why aren't you giving more?
Why aren't you giving?
So I guess my point in that was, is it okay if it's okay for your preacher to do, or if you would be mad that your preacher did that, if you'd be upset, why would you think you could do that? What's the difference there? I think our influence as Christians is important. Not that we have to do everything because we're afraid of how the world is going to perceive us, because that's just not, you can't, that's unsustainable. But we can, in the things we can control by common sense, we can look at how we're going to be an influence on somebody. Will that get in the way of glorifying God, providing the opportunity to show people what true stewardship, biblical stewardship looks like? Will I cause problems? Am I going to cause more problems than I'm going to solve for people with my influence? That's my big thing, is think about how you're impacting other people by what you're doing within reason, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Mine is an issue of contentment. There's a lot in the New Testament about the love of money. You guys brought that up earlier. Another passage is Hebrews 13, verse 5. Your conduct must be free from the love of money, and you must be content with what you have, for he has said, I'll never leave you, I'll never abandon you. And I know a lot of people go gamble and start their addiction and their problem because it's like, well, I have $1,000, but I owe the bank $10,000. I'll go to Vegas or wherever and gamble this, and I can make 13,000, and I'll pay the 10,000 off and have 3,000. And it sounds like a good idea at the time. Is God enough? I think that's a huge question that Christians in 21st century American culture need to ask. Is God? Because Jesus in the Gospels, and again, I don't necessarily know. I'll admit my hypocrisy. I don't know that I live according to how I think about this, which is a huge issue. But Jesus has a lot to say about living, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say a minimalistic lifestyle, not living in excess or extravagance. Not that having money is bad, but living where, like you guys said, store your treasures in heaven, Matthew 6. Don't accumulate for yourselves treasures on earth, Matthew 6:19, where moth and devouring insect destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but accumulate for yourselves treasure in heaven, where none of these things can decay, is just to kind of paraphrase the rest of the passage. And ultimately, verse 21 is the issue. Where your heart is, or where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Yeah. So am I content with what I have? And to kind of go back what I said earlier, am I willing to work to get what I don't have? I think gambling is the one problem I have with gambling for people who want to use it to make a living is that's the lazy man's way to get rich. And there's a lot in the Bible about working for what you have, using your hands, getting out there and actually grinding to make a living and providing for your family. And I have no sympathy for lazy people. I'll just tell you that at the front. But where your treasure is, there your heart's going to be. So are we content with what we have, and are we willing to work to get more? That's my issue.
Do I make the joke about you being a preacher only working 2 days a week, and you just made the comment about being lazy? Or
3 days a week.
3. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
2.5.
How dare I? But anyway. Well, guys, Jeremy, Billy, thank you guys so much for being on. I hope that whoever's listening or watching this at any point found this conversation be helpful, profitable for you in any way, form, or fashion. That's why we do this. We have all the counties. I say all the counties. We have all the regions of Tennessee covered. So if you've got questions, if you need to stop by, if you're driving through, you want to visit, you've got West, Middle, and East all covered here. I'm in West Tennessee. Joshua's in Middle. Jeremy and Billy are out there in East Tennessee. If you like this, keep tuning in and listening to us. Like, subscribe, share the post. Let us know what you think and give us topics that you want to hear about. Joshua, anything else before we sign off?
Go subscribe to Not Just Sundays. It's
Not
a great
Just
podcast.
Sundays. They're going to reboot it. We're putting them on the spot right now. They're going to reboot it eventually in the future. I didn't say when. I just said eventually in the future. So all you got to do is post one more in the future. And
I've got a lot of really good episodes.
Finale episode. Yeah.
We'll just repost this episode.
There you go. Yeah.
There you go.
Hey, that'd be fun.
That'll be perfect. That'll be perfect. But anyway, guys, again, Jeremy, Billy, thank you guys so much for being on. Until next time, everybody, we'll see you.
All right.